Time for some alternative syntaxes. There's nothing wrong with the way we provided our packages or our data thus far, but I'm always a fan of showing you alternative ways of doing something. For example, here in the main Dart file, we're having our change notifier provider where we need to provide that builder method, and this then actually runs this function, gets a context, returns the data we want to provide. If that data does not depend on the context, as we do here, it's kind of redundant to get that. Of course, you can then use an underscore to signal that you're not interested in it. But actually, there also is then a shortcut or an alternative constructor for a change notifier provider, which you could use, and that is the .value constructor. Instead of a builder, this simply takes a value argument, and that is the value you want to provide. And if your value doesn't depend on the context, you can absolutely use this instead of the builder method. And of course, it's the same in here in products grid, where I have the change notifier provider with that builder function. You can use that, but you can also use the value constructor of change notifier provider and simply provide a value, which in our case here is that single product. And if you do that and you do a full refresh here, of course, you see it still works as before, but now it's a bit shorter. So that's option number one, which makes sense if you're not really using the context. Now, there actually is an important difference between change notifier provider .value and the approach we had before with the builder function. This .value approach here is the right approach you should use if you, for example, use a provider on something that's part of a list or of a grid, because of the issue I described in the last lecture where widgets are recycled by Flutter, but the data that's attached to the widget changes. When using change notifier provider.value, you actually make sure that the provider works even if data changes for the widget. If you had a builder function, that would not work correctly. Here, it will work correctly because now the provider is tied to its data and is attached and detached to and from the widget instead of changing data being attached to the same provider. So this .value constructor syntax is the approach you should use in this scenario here and in all scenarios where you have the provider package and you're providing your data on single list or grid items where Flutter then actually will recycle the widgets you're attaching your provider to. With this .value constructor approach, that will work without issues. With the builder function we used before, that would cause bugs as soon as you have more items that do actually go beyond the screen boundaries because of the way widgets are recycled and your data changes and your provider wouldn't keep up with that. The .value constructor will keep up with that. That's just a little side note. Now, one other important note about change notifier provider, also with the .value approach here, in main Dart, where I'm also using this, here, there it's actually the better approach to not use this way of providing this product's value, but instead here, you should use that old approach of having the create or the builder method, where you then get your context and create products like this. Why? Because whenever you instantiate a class, so whenever you create a new object based on a class, as we're doing it here, if you do that to provide that object to the change notifier provider, you should use the create method for efficiency and to avoid bugs. Whenever you reuse an existing object, like we're doing it in the grid, where we cycle through a list of products which already all exist, it's recommended that you use that value approach, so with the .value constructor. Now, it would also work if we would use the .value constructor here in main Dart. It just might be a little bit less efficient and maybe lead to unnecessary re-renders, or in some apps it might be buggy. Therefore, when you create a new instance of an object and you want to provide this, use the create or the builder method, as I'm doing it here in main Dart now. If you reuse an existing object, like we're doing it in the products grid, you should use the .value provider with the value you're providing, as we're doing it here. Now, over the next lectures, you actually see that I, in the main Dart file, still use the .value provider, so the one I told you is not the best possible way of doing it, because it won't hurt this application. Just because it's not the best possible way does not mean that it doesn't work, that it crashes your app, or that it's super inefficient. I just want to tell you this best practice which emerged since I recorded the course so that you're aware of it. You could also use the other approach, which I'm going to use over the next lectures, but using create, if you are creating a new instance, is recommended. There's another important thing. If we navigate to a totally different screen, and with that I don't mean the detail screen, which is pushed on top of the grid screen, but if we had tabs or if we used push replacement, and we had a screen that replaces the old screen, then it's important that we clean up our provided data. Flutter automatically for you cleans up all the widgets it built so that they don't take up space in memory anymore. But your provided data would still end up in memory, and that would be bad, because the more often you then visit and leave that page, the more data is stored in memory, and that leads to memory leaks where your memory will at some point overflow. So it's important that you dispose of the data you're storing here. And here the good thing is, change notifier provider, no matter if you use it with the value constructor or not, automatically cleans up that data for you when it's not required anymore. So you don't have to worry about that. It's just important to be aware of that, because maybe you didn't think about that. And actually that would be pretty normal at this point that you don't think about this. But if you ever come to that point and you think, well, what's happening to my old data? No worries, change notifier provider cleans it up for you.